June 1944. Near Saint-Lô, France. Second Lieutenant Bill Blass crouched in a French hedgerow, dressed in the shoulder patches of the 2nd Armored Division, watching German reconnaissance aircraft circle overhead. Around him, spread across several square miles of Norman countryside, were what appeared to be hundreds of American tanks, artillery pieces, and supply vehicles, an armored division preparing for a major offensive. The German pilots photographed the concentration of forces, radioed reports back to their headquarters, and departed. Within hours, German intelligence would analyze the reconnaissance photos, identify the American units based on their distinctive shoulder patches and vehicle markings, and conclude that the 2nd Armored Division was positioning for an attack in this sector. German commanders would adjust their defensive dispositions accordingly, shifting reserves to counter the anticipated American offensive. But the 2nd Armored Division wasn't actually at Saint-Lô. The tanks the German pilots had photographed were inflatable rubber dummies. The artillery pieces were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The trucks were props. The radio traffic that German signals intelligence was intercepting came from a few radio operators simulating the communications of an entire division. And the American soldiers the Germans observed weren't combat troops, but artists, designers, actors, and audio engineers, members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. Bill Blass himself, before being drafted, had been a fashion designer in New York. After the war, he would return to fashion and become one of America's most famous designers. But in June 1944, he was a deception specialist whose job was to impersonate a tank officer, to be seen and photographed wearing the uniform of the 2nd Armored Division, to create the illusion that this division was where the Germans expected it to be, while the real division was actually positioning elsewhere for an entirely different operation. The Ghost Army was the most unusual military unit of World War II. 1,100 men whose weapons were creativity and deception, whose battlefield was the enemy's mind, and whose mission was to create illusions so convincing that German commanders would commit troops and resources to counter threats that didn't exist. Over the next 11 months, from June 1944 to the end of the war in May 1945, the Ghost Army would conduct over 20 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, convincing German forces that American divisions were positioned where they weren't, that offensives were planned that would never occur, that American strength was far greater than actual numbers. The operations saved thousands of American lives by misdirecting German forces, enabled successful offensives by concealing the actual locations and objectives of American attacks, and demonstrated that in modern warfare, deception could be as valuable as firepower. The Ghost Army fought with inflatable tanks, painted canvas, sound effects, radio transmissions, and theatrical performances, and their battles were as consequential as any fought by conventional forces. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the classified unit composed of artists and actors who used creativity as a weapon, who turned military deception into an art form, and who proved that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to make them believe things that aren't true. It's the story of how 1,100 unusual soldiers fought the war in their own way, how their achievements remained secret for 50 years after the war, and how their legacy influenced military deception operations from World War II through modern conflicts. To understand how the Ghost Army came to exist and why such an unusual unit was necessary, we need to understand the state of military deception in World War II and the specific challenges that Allied forces faced in the European theater. Military deception. The art of deliberately misleading enemies about your intentions, capabilities, and dispositions is as old as warfare itself. But World War II represented the first major conflict where deception could be conducted at strategic scale using modern technology. Radio communications could be monitored and deceived. Aerial reconnaissance could be fooled with dummy installations. Intelligence networks could be penetrated and fed false information. The British were masters of strategic deception, having developed sophisticated techniques through operations like Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that D-Day would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, and through the double-cross system, which turned German spies into channels for feeding false information. These strategic deceptions were planned at the highest levels, involved multiple intelligence agencies, and aimed to deceive German high command about major operations. But there was also a need for tactical deception, smaller-scale operations that would deceive German forces at the operational level about the positions and intentions of specific American units. If strategic deception was about fooling Hitler and his general staff, tactical deception was about fooling German division and corps commanders who were making immediate battlefield decisions. The American military established the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in early 1944, specifically to conduct tactical deception operations. The unit was composed of 4 separate specialized companies. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers were responsible for visual deception, creating dummy tanks, artillery, trucks, and installations that would fool German aerial reconnaissance and ground observers. The company included artists, designers, and engineers who could build convincing props quickly using inflatable rubber, painted canvas, and other lightweight materials. The 3102nd Signal Service Company, Special, conducted sonic deception, using powerful speakers to broadcast recorded sounds of tank movements, construction activities, and troop concentrations that would convince German forces that American units were present where they actually weren't. Signal Company Special operated radio deception, simulating the radio traffic of entire divisions using a small number of radio operators who transmitted messages designed to be intercepted by German signals intelligence and to create false impressions about unit locations and activities. The 406th Combat Engineers provided security and combat support for the deception operations, protecting the specialized companies while they conducted their work in forward areas close to German lines. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was commanded by Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a conventional Army officer who had the challenging task of leading a unit that operated completely differently from normal military organizations. Reeder had to manage artists who had never received military training, had to plan deception operations that required theatrical creativity rather than conventional military tactics, and had to operate under extreme secrecy. The Ghost Army's activities were classified at the highest levels because revealing their techniques would make future deception operations impossible. The unit was recruited selectively. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers sought artists, designers, and architects who could create convincing visual illusions. Many were recruited from art schools. The unit included students and recent graduates from institutions like Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Art Students League of New York. The Sonic Deception Company recruited audio engineers and sound technicians. The Radio Deception Company recruited operators who could convincingly simulate the radio procedures of different types of units. Among the Ghost Army's members were several who would become famous after the war in completely unrelated fields. Bill Blass would become a renowned fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly would become a major abstract artist. Art Kane would become a famous photographer. These men, and hundreds of others, spent 1944 to 1945 using their creative skills not to create art or fashion, but to deceive German forces and contribute to Allied victory. The Ghost Army trained in the United States through early 1944, developing techniques and equipment for their unusual mission. The 603rd Camouflage engineers worked with inflatable rubber tanks that could be inflated in minutes and looked convincing from the air or from a distance. The tanks weighed approximately 100 pounds each, could be carried by 2 men, and when inflated looked nearly identical to actual Sherman tanks, complete with realistic tracks, turrets, and gun barrels. The Sonic Deception Company recorded actual sounds of tank columns, construction activities, and troop movements, then developed systems for playing these recordings through powerful speakers that could be heard for miles. The recordings were sophisticated, not just engine noises, but the specific sounds of different types of vehicles, the patterns of movement that would indicate different types of military activities, the ambient sounds that would make the deception more convincing. The radio deception specialists studied the radio procedures of actual armored and infantry divisions, learning the patterns of traffic, the communication protocols, the variations in radio discipline that characterized different types of units. They developed the ability to simulate an entire division's radio traffic using just a handful of operators and radios. In June 1944, shortly after D-Day, the Ghost Army deployed to France and began operations. Their first mission was near Saint-Lô, where they impersonated the 2nd Armored Division to cover the actual division's movement to a different sector. The operation followed the pattern that would characterize all of the Ghost Army's work. Phase 1. Setup. The Ghost Army moved into an area where German reconnaissance could observe them. They inflated dummy tanks, erected fake artillery positions, set up dummy command posts, and positioned vehicles to create the impression of a division-sized force preparing for operations. Phase 2. Visual deception. Soldiers wearing the shoulder patches of the unit being impersonated moved through nearby towns where French civilians could see them. The assumption was that German intelligence networks included informants who would report American unit movements. Officers visited local headquarters and introduced themselves as being from the impersonated unit, knowing these visits would likely be reported. Phase 3. Radio deception. The signal company began broadcasting radio traffic simulating the impersonated unit's communications. German signals intelligence would intercept this traffic and use it to confirm the visual reports that the unit was present in this area. Phase 4. Sonic deception. At night, the Sonic Company played recordings of tanks and troops moving, creating the impression that the unit was conducting normal activities, moving equipment, conducting maintenance, preparing for operations. Phase 5. Sustainment. The deception had to be maintained long enough for the Germans to observe it, report it up their command chain, and commit to defensive dispositions based on it. This typically required the Ghost Army to remain in position for several days, maintaining the illusion, while the real unit they were impersonating conducted actual operations elsewhere. The Saint-Lô operation succeeded in drawing German attention to the wrong sector. German forces positioned to counter the fictional threat from the 2nd Armored Division in the area where the Ghost Army was operating, while the real 2nd Armored Division attacked elsewhere with less resistance than would have been encountered if the Germans had correctly identified its location. This pattern, misdirecting German forces by creating fictional threats that drew resources away from actual operations, characterized most of the Ghost Army's missions through 1944 and into 1945. But executing these deceptions required more than just deploying props and playing recordings. It required attention to detail, consistency, and creative problem-solving that turned each operation into a complex production. The visual deception had to be convincing from multiple perspectives. Inflatable tanks looked realistic from the air, but up close they were obviously fake. They made hollow sounds when touched, moved unrealistically in the wind, and lacked the weathering and maintenance signs of actual tanks. So the Ghost Army had to position the dummies where German ground observers couldn't get close enough to realize they were fakes, while ensuring they were positioned where German aerial reconnaissance could photograph them. The soldiers also had to behave like actual tank crews. They conducted simulated maintenance on the dummy tanks, moved them periodically, as if repositioning for tactical reasons, and generally created the activity patterns that would be expected from a real armored unit. This required that the artists and designers learn enough about actual tank operations to simulate them convincingly. The sonic deception had to match the visual deception. If the Ghost Army was simulating a division that included both tanks and infantry, the sound effects had to include both vehicle sounds and the sounds of large numbers of troops. If the deception suggested the unit was preparing for offensive operations, the sounds had to include construction noises, supply movements, and the increased activity levels that preceded attacks. The sonic company operated at night because sound travels further in darkness, and because German observation of the source of the sounds would be more difficult. The speakers were positioned several miles from the actual Ghost Army positions, so that German forces investigating the sounds wouldn't discover the deception unit. The recordings were played at volumes loud enough to be heard miles away, requiring careful management to avoid alerting nearby Allied units that weren't aware of the deception operation. The radio deception had to simulate not just the content of messages, but the patterns and procedures that characterized different types of units. German signals intelligence wasn't just intercepting messages. They were analyzing traffic patterns, sender-receiver relationships, radio discipline, and the subtle variations that indicated what type of unit was transmitting. The Ghost Army's radio operators had to replicate all of these characteristics convincingly. The operations were dangerous despite being deception rather than direct combat. The Ghost Army operated close to German lines, often in areas that were exposed to German artillery fire and raids. The need to be visible to German reconnaissance meant accepting that German forces would know approximately where the Ghost Army was positioned, creating risk of being targeted. Several Ghost Army members were killed or wounded during operations when German forces attacked positions they believed held actual combat units. The secrecy surrounding the Ghost Army's operations created additional complications. Most Allied units in the area weren't informed about the deception operations, so they would see what appeared to be another division moving into their sector, would report this up their chain of command, and would potentially adjust their own operations based on false information. Coordinating the deceptions without compromising operational security by revealing the Ghost Army's nature was a constant challenge. Through late 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France after breaking out from Normandy, the Ghost Army conducted operations almost continuously. They impersonated the 6th Armored Division near Brest, the 4th Armored Division near Metz, the 90th Infantry Division in Luxembourg. Each operation required customization, different unit insignia, different radio procedures, different tactical patterns. The cumulative effect of these operations was substantial. German intelligence consistently misidentified American unit positions based on Ghost Army deceptions. German forces committed reserves to counter threats that didn't exist, German commanders made tactical decisions based on false information about American strength and dispositions. The deceptions multiplied American effective strength. One actual division could appear to be in 2 or 3 places simultaneously through ghost army operations, forcing Germans to defend against multiple apparent threats with limited resources. December 1944. Luxembourg, near the German border. The Ghost Army was conducting one of its most ambitious deceptions, Operation Koblenz, when the situation changed dramatically. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its surprise Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, smashing through American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg with overwhelming force. The offensive threatened to split Allied forces, recapture vital supply ports, and potentially change the strategic situation in Western Europe. The Ghost Army found itself suddenly operating not behind secure Allied lines, but near areas where German forces were advancing rapidly. Operations that had been planned as routine tactical deceptions became desperate efforts to create illusions that might slow or misdirect German advances. The unit's mission shifted from supporting Allied offensives to helping stabilize the defensive crisis created by the German breakthrough. In late December 1944, the Ghost Army was ordered to impersonate the 4th Armored Division near Luxembourg City, creating the impression that this powerful American armored force was positioned to counterattack German advances from this direction. The actual 4th Armored Division was over 100 miles away, fighting desperately to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne. But if German commanders could be convinced that another American armored division threatened their southern flank, they might divert forces from the main offensive to counter this fictional threat. The operation was conducted under brutal winter conditions: freezing temperatures, snow and ice, limited daylight. Setting up the deception required the Ghost Army to work in exposed positions where German forces could observe them, but could also target them with artillery or raids. The inflatable tanks, which had been designed for summer and fall operations, became brittle and difficult to handle in freezing weather. The ground was too frozen to properly stake down the dummies, causing them to shift in the winter wind. The sonic deception faced different challenges. Sound traveled differently in cold air, and the frozen ground reflected sound in unpredictable ways. The recordings that had been effective in summer and fall conditions needed to be played at different volumes and from different positions to achieve the intended effect in winter. The Sonic Company's equipment, which included fragile vacuum tube amplifiers, struggled with the cold and required constant maintenance to keep operational. Despite these difficulties, the Luxembourg deception succeeded in its primary objective. German intelligence reported an American armored division in the area, and German forces adjusted their dispositions to account for this apparent threat. The diversion was modest compared to the scale of the Battle of the Bulge, but every German unit that was misdirected or held in reserve to counter fictional threats was unavailable to press the actual offensive. The Ghost Army's operations during the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the psychological dimension of military deception. The German commanders receiving reports about American force positions weren't making decisions in calm, analytical conditions. They were under extreme stress, managing a complex offensive across hundreds of miles, receiving fragmentary and often contradictory information from multiple sources. In these conditions, they had to make rapid decisions about where to commit reserves, which threats to prioritize, how to adjust the offensive as it developed. The Ghost Army's deceptions didn't have to be perfect to be effective. They just had to be plausible enough that stressed German commanders would factor them into their decision-making. A report of an American armored division in Luxembourg, confirmed by aerial reconnaissance photos and radio intercepts, would be taken seriously even if the evidence wasn't conclusive. German commanders couldn't afford to ignore potential threats, so they had to commit resources to counter them, even when they weren't certain the threats were real. This psychological dimension, exploiting the uncertainty and stress inherent in military decision-making, was fundamental to the Ghost Army's effectiveness. They weren't just creating physical illusions, but exploiting the cognitive limitations of enemy commanders who had to make decisions with incomplete information under time pressure. As the Battle of the Bulge was eventually contained and then reversed through January 1945, the Ghost Army resumed its role of supporting Allied offensives rather than stabilizing defensive crises. But the Bulge operations had revealed vulnerabilities in the Ghost Army's techniques and equipment that needed addressing. The inflatable tanks, while effective in many conditions, had limitations that became apparent during winter operations, and as the war moved into Germany, where terrain and conditions were different from France. The dummies were most convincing from the air, but were obviously fake to ground observers who got within a few hundred yards. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, and operations occurred in more confined terrain, where German ground observation was easier, maintaining the illusion became more difficult. The Ghost Army adapted by developing new techniques. They began using combinations of real and dummy equipment, mixing actual tanks with inflatables to create impressions of larger forces. They improved camouflage techniques to make it more difficult for ground observers to get close enough to identify the deceptions. They developed more sophisticated procedures for moving the dummies to simulate tactical repositioning more convincingly. The sonic deception evolved as well. The original recordings had been made in 1943 to 1944 and featured sounds of equipment from that period. By 1945, American forces were using newer equipment with different acoustic signatures. The Sonic Company recorded new sound effects featuring current equipment, created more varied recordings to prevent German forces from recognizing patterns if they heard the same recordings multiple times, and developed techniques for blending live sounds with recorded sounds to create more realistic audio environments. The radio deception became more sophisticated as Ghost Army operators gained experience. They learned to replicate not just the content and patterns of radio traffic, but the personalities and habits of specific radio operators. German signals intelligence officers analyzed radio traffic not just for content, but for operator characteristics, how individual operators formatted messages, their typing rhythms, their procedural variations. The Ghost Army's radio operators became skilled at creating operator personas that German analysts would recognize and track across operations. One of the Ghost Army's most successful operations occurred in March 1945 during Operation Viersen, which supported the Allied crossing of the Rhine River. The operation involved convincing German forces that the 30th Infantry Division and the 79th Infantry Division were concentrating for a crossing at one location, while the actual crossing would occur at a different point several miles away. The deception required the Ghost Army to split into multiple elements and conduct simultaneous operations at different locations. Part of the unit created the impression of the 30th Infantry Division preparing to cross at one point, while another element simulated the 79th Infantry Division at another location. Meanwhile, the actual divisions were concentrating at the real crossing point, concealing their preparations while German attention was focused on the fictional crossing points. The operation was complicated by the scale. Simulating two divisions simultaneously required all of the Ghost Army's resources and careful coordination to ensure that both deceptions were maintained consistently. The radio deception had to simulate two separate division radio networks operating independently. The visual deception had to create convincing force concentrations at both locations. The sonic deception had to suggest preparation activities at both fictional crossing points. The operation succeeded dramatically. German forces concentrated defenses at the fictional crossing points, left the actual crossing point lightly defended, and the Allied forces crossed the Rhine with far lighter casualties than would have been suffered if German forces had been properly positioned. The Ghost Army's deception was directly credited with saving hundreds, possibly thousands, of American lives by misdirecting German defensive efforts. As Allied forces advanced into Germany in April 1945 and the war approached its end, the Ghost Army's operations became more frequent and more daring. German forces were collapsing, but they were still capable of inflicting casualties, and German commanders were still making tactical decisions based on their assessment of American positions and intentions. Deception operations that could hasten German collapse or reduce American casualties remained valuable until the moment Germany surrendered. The Ghost Army's final operations in April-May 1945 occurred in Germany itself, close to German headquarters and communication centers where deception reports could reach decision-makers quickly. The operations were risky because they were conducted deep in German territory, where security couldn't be guaranteed, and where German forces, while collapsing, might still conduct desperate counterattacks against what they believed were key American units. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The Ghost Army's war was over. Over the previous 11 months, the unit had conducted over 20 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They had impersonated over a dozen different American divisions, had created thousands of dummy vehicles and installations, had broadcast hundreds of hours of sonic deceptions, and had transmitted countless simulated radio messages. The impact of these operations is difficult to quantify precisely because their success depended on German decisions that were influenced by multiple factors. But captured German intelligence documents examined after the war revealed that German forces had consistently misidentified American unit positions based on Ghost Army deceptions, had committed reserves to counter fictional threats, and had made tactical decisions based on false assessments of American strength and dispositions. Military historians conducting post-war analysis estimated that Ghost Army operations had contributed to saving between 15,000 and 30,000 American casualties by misdirecting German forces and enabling successful operations at reduced cost. The unit's cost in American lives was remarkably low. Fewer than a dozen Ghost Army members were killed during the war, primarily from German artillery fire or during the Battle of the Bulge chaos. But despite these achievements, the Ghost Army's story remained classified for 50 years after the war. The techniques they had developed were considered too valuable to reveal. The inflatable equipment, the sonic deception methods, the radio simulation procedures. All of these might be useful in future conflicts, and revealing them would make enemies aware of deception possibilities. The unit was disbanded shortly after the war ended. Members returned to civilian life under orders not to discuss their wartime service. When asked what they had done during the war, most Ghost Army veterans provided vague answers about being in a headquarters unit or working in camouflage. The specific nature of their work remained secret. This secrecy created a strange situation for Ghost Army veterans. They had participated in significant military operations, had contributed to Allied victory in measurable ways, but couldn't discuss their achievements or be recognized for them. While veterans of conventional combat units could share their experiences and be honored for their service, Ghost Army veterans maintained silence, keeping secrets that they had been ordered to protect. Some found this silence difficult. Artists who had created convincing illusions that had fooled German forces, who had used their creative skills in service of military objectives, couldn't discuss their most significant work. The fashion designers, artists, photographers, and audio engineers who had spent a year conducting military deception operations returned to their civilian careers without being able to explain what they had learned or how they had served. Bill Blass returned to fashion design and never publicly discussed his Ghost Army service during his lifetime. Ellsworth Kelly became a famous abstract artist without revealing that he had spent the war creating realistic deceptions. Art Kane became a renowned photographer, his most famous work being the 1958 photograph, A Great Day in Harlem, but his wartime contribution to military deception remained unknown to most people who knew his photographic work. The secrecy began to lift in the 1980s as the Cold War was winding down and as the specific techniques the Ghost Army had used were becoming obsolete with modern surveillance technology. The inflatable tanks that had fooled 1940s aerial reconnaissance couldn't deceive modern satellites or infrared sensors. The sonic deceptions that had worked when most intelligence came from human observation were less effective in an era of electronic surveillance. In 1996, the Ghost Army's history was declassified. Veterans were finally authorized to discuss their service, and researchers began documenting the unit's operations and achievements. Books and documentaries were produced, bringing the Ghost Army's story to public attention for the first time. The public reaction was fascination mixed with disbelief. The idea that artists and audio engineers had fought the war with inflatable tanks and sound effects seemed almost comical. But the documentation, the operational reports, the captured German intelligence assessments, the testimonies of veterans and of German officers who had been deceived, confirmed that the operations had been real and had been effective. In 2013, Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors, recognizing their contribution to victory in World War II. By this time, many Ghost Army veterans had died, but surviving members attended the ceremony and finally received public recognition for service that had been secret for 7 decades. The ceremony was emotional for the veterans, men who were now in their late 80s and 90s, who had kept secrets for most of their lives, who had watched comrades from conventional units be honored while their own contributions remained unknown. These men finally received acknowledgement that their unusual service had mattered, that their creative approach to warfare had saved lives and contributed to victory. The artistic work that Ghost Army members created during the war has become recognized as significant in its own right. The sketches, paintings, and photographs that members created while in Europe, documenting their experiences, recording the places they operated, creating art for personal satisfaction during periods of downtime, have been exhibited in museums and galleries. The work is interesting not just as historical documentation, but as art created under unusual circumstances by artists who were serving military purposes while maintaining their artistic identities. Some of this artwork shows the strange juxtaposition of art and war that characterized the Ghost Army's experience. Paintings of French villages where the artists had conducted deception operations. Sketches of soldiers inflating dummy tanks. Photographs of the theatrical props and equipment that constituted the unit's arsenal. The artwork documents a unique military experience where creativity was weapon and where art served strategic purposes. The The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their specific World War II operations to broader influence on military deception doctrine. The techniques they developed and refined, combining visual, sonic, and electronic deception in coordinated operations, became doctrinal foundations for U.S. military deception planning. During the Cold War, the military developed increasingly sophisticated deception capabilities based on Ghost Army principles. Dummy equipment became more realistic. Electronic warfare capabilities allowed for more sophisticated radio deception. Psychological operations incorporated lessons about how to exploit enemy commanders' cognitive limitations and decision-making under uncertainty. In the 1991 Gulf War, coalition forces used deception operations that were conceptual descendants of Ghost Army techniques. Dummy equipment and false radio traffic convinced Iraqi forces that the main coalition attack would come from one direction, while the actual left hook flanking maneuver came from a completely different direction. The deception contributed to the lopsided victory, where Iraqi forces were defeated quickly, with minimal coalition casualties. Modern military deception continues to incorporate principles that the Ghost Army demonstrated. The importance of consistency across multiple forms of deception, visual, electronic, behavioral. The need to understand enemy intelligence collection methods to ensure deceptions are observed as intended, and the value of exploiting enemy commanders' assumptions and psychological limitations. But modern deception faces challenges that didn't exist in World War II. Satellite surveillance can observe installations constantly and from multiple angles, making purely visual deceptions more difficult. Electronic surveillance can analyze radio signals with sophistication that makes simple radio simulation inadequate. The proliferation of sensors and the networking of intelligence systems means that deceptions have to be consistent across many more dimensions to be effective. Despite these challenges, the fundamental principle remains valid. Military forces can gain advantage by making enemies believe things that aren't true, and well-executed deception can achieve objectives at lower cost than direct confrontation. The Ghost Army proved this principle in operational conditions, demonstrating that creativity and deception could be as valuable as firepower and armor. The story of the Ghost Army also raises interesting questions about the relationship between art and war, between creativity and violence. The unit's members were artists who used their artistic skills for military purposes, creating illusions that would deceive enemies, designing installations that looked real but weren't, producing theatrical performances where the audience was enemy forces and the goal was convincing them of false narratives. Some might view this as corruption of art, using creative skills to support violence and death. But the Ghost Army veterans themselves generally viewed their service as using their particular abilities to contribute to a just cause. They were fighting fascism using the skills they possessed, applying their creativity to save lives rather than take them. The deceptions they created prevented casualties by misdirecting enemy forces rather than by killing enemy soldiers. This perspective, that contributing to military victory using one's particular skills was honorable service regardless of whether those skills were conventional military abilities, reflects broader understanding about how modern warfare requires diverse capabilities and how victory depends on contributions from people with varied backgrounds and abilities. The Ghost Army also demonstrated that military effectiveness doesn't require conformity to traditional military culture. The unit was full of individuals who didn't fit conventional soldier stereotypes, artists who had never fired weapons, designers who were more interested in aesthetics than tactics, intellectuals who questioned authority and procedure. Yet these unusual soldiers contributed significantly to military success by applying their unconventional skills to military problems. This lesson, that military organizations benefit from diversity of thought and skills, that unconventional approaches can produce valuable results, that rigid adherence to traditional military culture can exclude people whose contributions would be valuable, remains relevant for modern military organizations struggling to recruit and retain people with specialized technical and creative skills. For the individual Ghost Army veterans, their wartime experience was formative, but often difficult to integrate into their post-war lives. They had spent a year living with extreme stress, conducting operations close to enemy forces, accepting risk that German artillery or raids might kill them, maintaining secrecy even among other American units. But they couldn't discuss this experience, couldn't process it through sharing stories with people who would understand, couldn't receive recognition that might have helped them contextualize what they had done. Many struggled with what we would now call PTSD, nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty readjusting to civilian life. But the secrecy meant they couldn't explain to family or friends what they had experienced or why they were struggling. They were just veterans who seemed to have difficulty adjusting, whose wartime service was vaguely described as headquarters work or camouflage, whose stress seemed disproportionate to what people assumed they had experienced. The declassification in 1996 was liberating for many veterans. They could finally discuss what they had done, could explain to families what their service had actually involved, could connect with fellow veterans and share memories of their unusual war. The recognition, while coming 50 years late, provided validation that their service had been important and that the secrecy that had isolated them had been necessary rather than arbitrary. Today, the Ghost Army's story is preserved through multiple channels. The Smithsonian Institution holds a collection of Ghost Army materials, including inflatable equipment, sonic recordings, and documentation of operations. The National Archives contains operational records, after-action reports, and intelligence assessments documenting the unit's activities. Museums across the country have exhibited Ghost Army artwork and equipment. A documentary film, The Ghost Army, was released in 2013, bringing the story to wide audiences through television and streaming platforms. The film features interviews with surviving veterans, historical footage and photographs, and expert analysis of the operations and their impact. The documentary has introduced the Ghost Army's story to generations who weren't alive during World War II, and who find the concept of military deception through art almost fantastical. The story resonates particularly with people interested in the intersection of art and unconventional problem-solving. The Ghost Army represents an extreme example of applying creative thinking to practical problems, of using skills that seem completely unsuited to military purposes: painting, sculpture, audio engineering, theatrical performance, to achieve strategic military objectives. Educational programs now use the Ghost Army as a case study in creative problem-solving, in thinking unconventionally about challenges, and in recognizing that diverse skills can contribute to solving difficult problems. Business schools teach the Ghost Army story as an example of how unconventional approaches can produce valuable results, when conventional approaches would be inadequate or too costly. The Ghost Army's legacy is ultimately about expanding understanding of what contributes to military victory, and about recognizing that warfare in modern age requires more than just combat soldiers with weapons. The artists who created convincing illusions, the audio engineers who produced realistic sound effects, the radio operators who simulated division-level communications, These people contributed to victory as surely as soldiers who fought with rifles and tanks. Their weapons were creativity, attention to detail, understanding of human psychology, and willingness to use their unusual skills in service of military objectives. Their battlefield was the enemy's mind, where perceptions and beliefs determined decisions and where false perceptions could produce decisive advantages. Their victory was measured not in enemy soldiers killed, but in enemy soldiers misdirected, in resources committed to counter fictional threats, in casualties prevented through deception rather than firepower. The 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, fought World War II with inflatable tanks, painted canvas, sound effects, and radio transmissions. They conducted over 20 major deception operations across Western Europe, impersonated over a dozen American divisions, created thousands of dummy installations, and convinced German forces that American strength was greater and positioned differently than it actually was. They contributed to saving thousands of American lives, enabled successful operations at reduced cost, and demonstrated that in modern warfare, making enemies believe things that aren't true can be as valuable as defeating them in direct combat. Their story remained secret for 50 years, hidden because the techniques they developed were considered too valuable to reveal. When the story finally emerged, it seemed almost unbelievable. Artists fighting with props, soldiers wielding creativity as weapons, warfare conducted through theatrical performance and audio production. But the documentation confirmed every detail, and the Ghost Army's contribution to victory was finally recognized 7 decades after their unusual war ended. The artists who fooled Hitler, the soldiers who fought with imagination rather than ammunition, the Ghost Army, proof that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is not to fight them directly, but to make them fight shadows, to convince them to defend against threats that don't exist, to win through deception what would cost too much to win through force. The most unusual unit of World War II, whose strange weapons and unconventional tactics produced conventional military success, whose story was hidden for half a century, but whose legacy continues to influence military deception and creative problem-solving decades after their war ended.